Welcome to MySQL Lesson 4. This video will introduce you to a few of the many data types that are available in MySQL. As your lesson indicated, there are many data types used by MySQL, and they are really quite common throughout the industry in other languages. However, you're going to find a few differences that we're going to demonstrate right here. We'll start by using a new database that I've loaded from the MySQL website. It is called Menagerie. This database can be found at this website link, dev.mysql.com/doc. And then there are several zip files, including the Menagerie database. If you would like to follow along, feel free to load it now, and then you can come back to the video and follow along with me. In order to make this demonstration fit a few of the things I wanted to show you, I had to add a couple of fields, some variables called weight and length _inches. Weight is a decimal. It is a total of 5 digits with 3 digits after the decimal point. And length _inches is an integer, and there's going to be some interesting information to note about how these are used. Additionally, you'll see that there are variable characters and enum, and a couple of dates. After loading all the data into the database, I wanted to do a quick query of the first 1,000 rows. Of course, there are less than that in this particular database. The workbench provides a built-in command, and all you have to do is right-click the table. And next you would click on the menu item that is labeled Select Rows Limit 1000. I'm also going to go back and type in the same exact command, except that I don't have a limit, just to show you that it will show you the exact same information. So I'm going to say select star from pet, and then I'll run it using the lightning bolt. Now I'm going to open an SQL file that will contain a script to insert another entry into the table for the pets. It will actually insert an additional record called Puffball, and it is a hamster owned by Diane. It is a female, and it has this information. I execute the command, add that hamster, and oh, it looks like I'm going to get an error message. That's because I used a file that had only the columns that were in the original database, and you remember I added a couple of new columns back when we started. So what I'm going to do is check and see what those columns look like. Make sure I've got the right information, and then go and modify it here to give an appropriate weight and length to this hamster. Bear in mind that the information is in sequence, so I have to put the weight and length right after the sex information. So I put it after the quote F quote. It has to be within quotes. I use 3.2 pounds. It also has to be separated by commas, and I use 8.2 inches. And there you go. Now this is ready to run and actually insert Puffball into our database table. After I click on the lightning bolt, I can look down below and verify that this record was accepted and inserted. And indeed, as you can see here, it was. I will go up and click on the query that I showed you earlier to select all of the records, and at the bottom, we're seeing Puffball. An interesting point to make about Puffball is that his length is not 8.2 inches. It was rounded to only 8 inches. That is a format that would default because I gave it a decimal number, and this is actually an integer. Now that we have a listing of all of the pets from our Menagerie database, I just wanted to point out that you can also use a feature in the workbench to resort any records in any sequence that you prefer. In this case, I've clicked on the sex, and it has resorted them by sex, and then clicked on owner, and it resorted them by the owner. Normally, outside of the workbench, you would need to use the order by statement added to any query so that you can run it, and you could order by a different variable. Now we're going to shift gears a little bit and look at something that was discussed in section 3.3 of your text. It's called the SQL mode, and this is the system variable that allows you to reject invalid values, and sometimes you can selectively suppress some data validation. For instance, allow invalid dates. This is what the current default was for this database. As you can see, it's a strict validation. I'm going to go back in now and do a new insert to show you how it will reject some of these values based on what I input and based on the information that it requires. This new insert will be for a pet named Melon Ball. The owner is Joseph, and it's a snake. Now after that, I've actually made some invalid values. The sex is X, the weight is ABC, and the date of birth is XYZ. Obviously, these are going to be invalid values. When I run it, I should get an error message down below. By looking at the message on the output line, it says we get an error code 1265 data truncated for column sex in row 1. That's because the sex has to be an M or an F because it's an enum. By changing it to a null value, which would be a quote followed by a quote with nothing between, it would get past that error message. But now it's going to come up with an incorrect decimal value, ABC, for the column weight. Since this database has strict editing, it's going to stop every time it hits an error. To avoid this, you might need to create data validation routines of your own, or just turn them off entirely and not have strict editing. So I'm going to go up and change that weight to a proper value. First I will try a null and run it again, and it is acceptable. By the way, you might consider 6.8 to be invalid data for the length in inches since it is an integer. However, with type conversion, as discussed in section 3.5.2 of your text, SQL is able to handle it quite nicely and will round to the nearest value either higher or lower as an integer. Run it again. Our next error should be with the XYZ, and it is. So now I'm going to change the date to 2012-12-28, and then we will run this insert, and looking below at the messages, we will see that melon ball was successfully added to the pet table. So as you can see, there is a great deal of editing that goes on normally. You can also run the query, take a look at where melon ball is added, and also notice that the sex is an empty value because we did give it a null, or a quote followed immediately by a quote, which is a valid value in the enum that we used for defining this column. Now we're down to the final demonstration for this lesson. We're going to look at how you can change what type of SQL mode you have so that you can have an invalid date. In this case, we're actually going to input a date that isn't valid. First, we're going to change the SQL mode. We change it to strict _all _tables and then comma, allow _invalid _dates, all within single quotes. After we set the SQL mode to a new value of allow invalid dates, then we'll go back over to our insert that we were using before, and I'm going to quickly modify it to a different pet. The pet's name is Rollerball, and he has a lot of other information, but mainly it has a 0 in the year. When I run it, you will see that it has created this Rollerball with a 0 in the year and allows it just fine. And that's because we did say allow invalid dates in the SQL mode. This demo has been a quick look at some of the various data types used in MySQL, and also how to set the MySQL mode that can allow for editing of data, whether it is done at a default value or as a value you set yourself.